Good evening. My name is Dennis Swybold, and on behalf of the President's Lecture Series in the School of Journalism, I'd like to thank President Royce Engstrom and Provost Perry Brown for their support for tonight's lecture. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce this evening's speaker, Mark Leibovich, Chief National Correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. He's been with the Times since 2006. Before that, he wrote for the Washington Post, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Boston Phoenix. He won a coveted National Magazine Award in 2011 for his Times Magazine profile of Politico's Mike Allen, and in 2002 he published his first book, The New Imperialists, a look at the digital empires created by Bill Gates, Steve Case, Larry Ellison, John Chambers, and Jeff Bezos. His latest book is the New York Times and Washington Post bestseller, This Town, Two Parties and a Funeral, plus plenty of valet parking in America's gilded capital. It's an insider's look at the ultimate insiders, those who wield power and influence in Washington and the lengths they go to perpetuate it. It's about frantic networking, the striving to be seen close to power, and the shameless efforts by former officials and fixtures to cash in on their political careers. It's not a pretty tale. As CNN's Fareed Zakaria writes, many decades from now, a historian looking at where America lost its way could use this town as a primary source. As depressing as it may sound, this story is told in vivid and hilarious detail. I guarantee that it will make you laugh, if only to keep from crying. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mark Leibovich.
Whoa. Wow, I got the whistle. Thank you, everyone. It's amazingly great to be in Montana. I was telling some people earlier that I'm sort of new at this speech thing. I like traveling to places, and I have a day job, and I have 3 young kids. So a few weeks ago I said, please, if I'm going to travel and do some talks, can you try to keep it close to D.C. so I can day trip? And then a day later I got this thing, hey, the University of Montana wants you to come out. And I'm like, good, do it, book it, do it. And I love Montana, and I say that based on exactly one visit here over the years. And the visit took place in 2009. I was doing a story for the Times on Max Baucus, and he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and that was the summer the Tea Party was really getting crystallized, and the debate over health care was really picking up. And President Obama was coming through Bozeman, and I remember interviewing Senator Baucus over breakfast at some hotel in Bozeman, and Jim Messina, a distinguished graduate of this university, who was a longtime aide to Senator Baucus, then working in the White House, saw us, and he was leaving, and he said to Senator Baucus, hey, Tapper Light. And he said, hey, Tapper Light. And I'm like, what on earth does that mean? And Baucus says, oh, it's an old mining term. So apparently I thought that was like the Montana thing. So whenever I would get up to the hill, to Capitol Hill, there'd be these scrums around these senators who people want to talk to, and reporters would be swarming them. And Senator Baucus would often be in the middle of these things, and he's not always the most social guy in the world. But I could always yell after him, hey, Senator, Tapper Light. And he goes, hey, yeah. So that was always my in. And I was emailing with Jim Messina just the other day about what to do in Missoula, where I've never been before, and he went to school here. And he gave me a bunch of recommendations of places to go to in the 24 hours I have, and hopefully I'll get to many of them between now and my 4 a.m. wake-up call tomorrow morning. And I then said, my second question is, if I say Tapper Light, is anyone going to know what I'm talking about when I go to Montana? He said, no one under the age of 65. And I put this question to a group of journalism students that I had lunch with today, and they agreed that about 2 people knew, and apparently the mining term, for those of you, I can now tell you how the silver and copper mines of Montana work. The dynamite that when you someone can correct me too, there is a little hole in the mine, and when you put the dynamite in, you have to tap it light to set off the dynamite, but not so fast that it hurts you. So you don't want to tap it heavy, but you want to tap it light. Anyway, I told the lunch group that in the spirit of journalism and in the spirit of conversation, I would put this to the group and see what kind of reaction it got. So I would now ask you, how many people have heard of this expression before? I would say it's a distinct minority. Okay, so my market research is done. I will report back to Jim and Senator Baucus immediately. Another thing about Montana is this is one of those states where something immediately special rubbed off on me, and like in the one trip I made here. And one of the things I do in interviewing politicians, and I always have this favorite question, and it's at the end, I will ask them, usually off the record, but what the hell, if you could not live in your home state, where would you move? And you get almost the same five answers every time. You often hear Hawaii, you often hear California, you often hear New York, sometimes you hear Florida, you almost always get Montana. And these are people who have either been through here briefly, who have spent significant time here, but it does have an appeal, and that was one of the things I was responding to when I immediately said, yes, book me to Montana, I will go there, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So thank you for having me. And now, the immediate character question I would have about anyone who came through here is why they would ever leave. And I'm proud to say that I ran up to that M this morning because I was on East Coast time and I woke up and I couldn't sleep. So anyway, so this book has been a great opportunity to come out and leave Washington and to talk to people. And I've had this masterful marketing campaign around the book, which is after the book came out, after a couple months, I decided that we would plan a government shutdown. And we would plan to have a situation that goes from dysfunctional to even more dysfunctional to tear your hair out, if in fact I had hair, dysfunctional, and that would keep the conversation going. It would make the notion of what makes Washington so dysfunctional and so objectionable and so disappointing relevant. And what this has forced me to do is everywhere I go, I've had to sort of adjust things for breaking news, and everyone asks me when the shutdown is going to end and whether we're going to go over the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling and so forth. And my answer is I don't know, but I will say that I don't think I've met a single person who's happy about what's going on in Washington, D.C. That's true of people in Washington. It's true of people in Montana. Another thing about Montana that I wanted to talk about is this is the Stan Kimmett lecture. Stan Kimmett was the Secretary of the Senate. He was a longtime protege of Mike Mansfield, who was, arguably the most famous graduate of this university, and a towering figure in the U.S. Senate. And a few weeks ago, I got an email from Bob Kimmett, who is Stan's son, who was a Deputy Secretary of the Treasury under President Bush 43. And he took me to lunch, and he wanted to get to know me. He wanted to tell me about his dad, and he wanted to tell me about Montana, and tell me about why this lecture was important to him and his family, and also to the community. And he told me this story. And I didn't know much about Stan Kimmett at all. I knew that, he was esteemed. He loved the institution of the Senate. He loved Montana. And Bob told me that Stan was very, very active in the Democratic Leadership Council, which is a group of conservative Democrats that sort of came of age in the 90s that was trying to get the Democratic Party more to the center to try to gain a more consensus, gaining, party to be inclusive of more conservative views. And Bill Clinton was one of the charter members, and Stan Kimmett was one of the more active members of this. And so when Stan Kimmett was working for Mike Mansfield, he was sitting in Mansfield's office, and Senator William Fulbright, sent a young intern across Capitol Hill to do some kind of errand. And you see young people doing errands on Capitol Hill all the time. I mean, it's the young 20-somethings are gophers, essentially. And this kid came through, and he dropped off a sheet of paper from Senator Fulbright for Senator Mansfield. And before he could get away to go back to Senator Fulbright's office, this gentleman, Stan Kimmett, said, "Tell me about yourself, son." And the two of them had a conversation that lasted an hour, and this intern was struck that anyone would take an interest in him and wanted to know about his life and his upbringing and his dreams and what he was doing and how he liked it and how he could help. And it left an incredible impression on him. And that intern for William Fulbright was Bill Clinton. And Bob told me the story of after Clinton was elected president in 1992, he went back to a big ceremony from the Democratic Leadership Conference in Washington. And, you know, he was the man of the hour. He had just been elected president. And he saw this older guy sitting like off to the side. And Bill Clinton recognized him immediately, hadn't seen him in years, walked over and visited with him for a good maybe 5 or 6 minutes before his speech. That was Stan Kimmett. And then he went up and he didn't talk to anyone else before his speech. And Bob told me that that was an incredible moment for his dad. It meant the world to him. And I always thought that that was a great lesson in just, you know, giving the time of day and taking an interest in young people, remembering where you came from, and just really treating people decently and as human beings. And that brings me to a piece of breaking news that I'd like to report from Washington on a purely personal level, which is my 6-year-old daughter was just named to the student council in her elementary school yesterday. And I said, yeah, let's give it up for Frances. And I said, Frances, this is great news. So what do you have to do now? She said, well, I have to behave with a sense of community. I have to behave with kindness, and I have to cooperate with my fellow students and my fellow student council people. And my 12-year-old, who is, of course, an expert in all things, said, yeah, our Congress could learn a few things from that rule right now. And then one of her friends, who was also a bit of an adolescent know-it-all, pointed out that CO, like the word cooperation, the word community, the word collaboration, is also the root of CO for Congress. And Congress literally means a coming together of people to build consensus, another CO word. And it's really striking. Certainly, it was one of these out of the mouths of babes moments for me to hear my daughter talk like that. It was very innocent, and just how little of that is going on right now. So that brings me to why we're here, why I'm here, and why on earth I decided to write this book 5 years ago. And the book, as Dennis said, is called This Town. And this town refers to this two-word refrain that people inside Washington, how they talk about Washington. They will say, well, in this town, this is how things are done, or I've been in this town for so long, or in this town, this is what they do to people. And it's become a bit of a cliche. And so I decided I would name the book This Town. And I want to make a distinction about what this town means and who these people are. The people of this town are not the tens of thousands of people in the Washington, D.C. area who have been furloughed. The people of this town are not the dozen or so men and women who lost their lives at the Naval Yard last month in the horrible shooting. The people of this town are essentially the political class. These are the people who go to Washington, who stay, whose notion of public service is defined by their standing as a TV commentator, as a lobbyist, as someone who knows how Washington works, as someone who can define themselves as an insider. And one of the things that I have been asked a lot about is how can Washington be as divided as it is? How did it get here? And I try to turn this conversation on its head where I say, I just wrote a whole book about how Washington, while it might be hopelessly divided politically, is in fact hopelessly interconnected. These are all people who belong to the same system. They value the same sort of ethic of self-perpetuation. They are, the vast majority of people are staying in Washington, whereas before the original ethic of public service was to go to Washington, work, re-immerse yourself in your community after you were finished, and then perform your public service at a community level. And about 5 years ago, I decided that my life was very, very comfortable inside Washington, D.C. I worked for a major news organization. I covered politics. I love politics. I got to go to all these events. I was invited to all these dinner parties. I was invited, I could talk to whoever I wanted to. And I realized I just kept running into the same people, and the same tropes were used over and over again, and the same language was spoken. And I remember the moment I decided to write this book was, I was sitting in Tim Russert's funeral. And Tim Russert was this giant of a newsman. He hosted Meet the Press for many, many years, this great institution, both the show and Tim himself. And he was the most influential and powerful journalist in Washington at the time. And he passed away in June of 2008 at this dawn of this historic presidential election, at this moment where people were tuned into politics in a huge, huge way. Barack Obama was about to be the first black candidate to be nominated by a major party. John McCain was about to be nominated by the Republicans. And his memorial service at the Kennedy Center was this extravagant event. It was, you had all of the people there. I mean, everyone, wall-to-wall famous people, essentially. You had the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obamas, the McCains, the Barbara Walters, the, all the major anchors and so forth. And it was really a see and be seen place. And I remember sitting there, I knew Tim a tiny bit. I remember looking around and just seeing everyone sort of treating the event like a cocktail party, and everyone sort of working the room, and everyone trying to get some kind of angle to get an interview with candidate X, or some kind of booking for their client to get Hillary Clinton on this MSNBC show. And people actually signing autographs, and people actually angling for jobs at a funeral. And I remember at that moment looking around and starting to take notes on my program, which probably was pretty tacky in itself now that I think about it. But deciding that, okay, this is a moment, and this is a world where the level of sort of self-congratulation and lack of self-consciousness about what is decent and what is done has completely overtaken, how most people would view conduct at a memorial service. And I realized at that moment that it was a very comfortable place to be, and I wanted to start writing about this world, because I knew that people intuitively did not like Washington. They didn't like how it was working. I mean, the notion that Washington is a disappointing city to people outside of Washington is not new. And I decided that I would sort of become a quasi-anthropologist and write about what this culture is like over a 5-year period. And so I set about trying to really deconstruct this particular scene, and then I sort of go from June of 2008 through the first election of President Obama through January of 2013, which was the second inauguration of President Obama, and essentially write a massive profile of a city, and sort of to take away and sort of give people a fuller cinematographic version of the carnival that has gone on here. And what you've seen and what I've seen is a picture of incredible disconnect. You have Washington, D.C., which is the wealthiest metropolitan area in the United States right now, by far. It is home to 7 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States by far, in the metropolitan area of Washington. This has all happened at a time when the rest of the country has largely struggled economically over the last 5 years. And there's also been a disconnect between the level of revulsion that many people outside of Washington have felt for the way the Capitol is or is not working, and a level of sort of blissful celebration of self inside. And another really striking thing that I've seen, and to talk about what Washington has become, is that people tend not to leave anymore. 50% of all United States senators, after they're elected out of office or after they retire, go on to become lobbyists. That figure compares to 3% in 1974. It's 42% of all congressmen and women will stay in Washington to lobby or do something else. I mean, there's a whole other subgroup of people who don't actually register to lobby, but they consult. And again, in 1974, that was 3%. So what you have here are people who are elected to office or who go to Washington ostensibly to work in public service, but what their life becomes is an entry into a political class. And the political class is this big, encompassing economy that is partly it's government workers, but partly it's also the derivative pundits. It's the people you see on TV yelling at each other. It's the people you see on the floor of the Senate and the House yelling at each other, or consulting politicians on how to destroy each other, or lobbying for a particular interest against another particular interest. And none of these people are on furlough right now. These are people who are all getting paid right now. The people who are yelling at each other on TV, the people who are making the decisions, the people who are angling in some way to perpetuate their careers in Washington are all getting paid right now. And it distilled for me what has happened to Washington, which is it has become, in the words of Tom Coburn, who is a Republican senator from Oklahoma, a permanent feudal class of insiders. People now go to Washington, D.C. to get rich. That was not true 20 years ago. There was just so much more money in the system, it enables that. This also comes at a time when new media has exploded and it has given everyone a platform, if you want it. It has given people the opportunity to get 30,000 Twitter followers or a Facebook page or a blog, and all of a sudden you too can be a pundit, you too can be famous, you too can join the noise machine. And look, there's a great incentive for it. And how do you bring that back to what we have now? And if you look at Ted Cruz, who is certainly the most talked about person other than maybe the president and the Speaker of the House in Washington right now, Ted Cruz wants to run for president. He does not want to, I don't think, pass any bills in the Senate. I mean, he was elected less than a year ago. He does not want to win the respect of his colleagues. He wants to sort of become famous. He wants to become a media star. And C-SPAN's ratings went up 500% when he did his 21-hour filibuster last week. So what's been interesting since his book has come out 3 months ago is that the premise of it has kept affirming itself, and I haven't had to make any arguments because all you have to do is check the newspaper, and the notion of self-service at the expense of public service comes to light every single day. So, one of the things, so people ask me a lot of the same questions, and one of the things I've liked to do is to sort of think about, one, how we got here, and I think clearly one of the ways we've gotten here is just the flood of money into the political system over the last 30 years. That has enabled people to stay. And I think about a story that's, I think, on chapter 3 of the book, in which I talked to Senator Lott, Trent Lott, who was a Senate Majority Leader in the Republican Party, longtime senator from Mississippi. And he quit sort of abruptly in 2007, and he is now a lobbyist. He's making a few $1 million a year, at least. And I was interviewing him a few years ago for this book, and he was going on and on and on, as people do, about how much he hates Washington. And one of the things about people in Washington always talk about how much they hate Washington, especially when they're running for re-election to get back to Washington. And they say, I'm going to drain the swamp, and you just see, I'm going to change that place, and then more often than not, they settle into the swamp like a warm bath. So Trent Lott was having this warm bath moment where he was saying, well, yeah, I would much rather be down in Mississippi because that's where I was raised and I love it there. I'm like, so why are you here, Senator? And he looked at me as if assessing my sanity, and he said, well, this is where the money is. I mean, where else am I going to make a few $1 million a year? I mean, I can call my former colleagues, and I can make all kinds of money. And Trent Lott was refreshingly honest. I mean, a lot of times, mostly with Democrats, you see people who are just so afraid to call themselves lobbyists, so afraid to say that they're actually working for corporations and so forth. They like to say, I'm a policy advisor, or I'm a strategic consultant. They use words other than lobby. But again, I mean, Trent Lott, many years ago would have gone home. And I tell this story, and I told it last week in Missouri, and because I happened to be, I got to Missouri on the day the shutdown started, and I went to the Arch, which was closed, and then at the Arch I found, it was just right near my hotel, and at the Arch I found a couple of people who had just been furloughed from Scott Air Force Base across the river in Illinois. And so not only had they been furloughed and they weren't getting paid, but they go to the Arch because they had a day off and they couldn't even go to the Arch. Good thing is you can see the Arch from a while. But obviously you go to Missouri, you think of Harry Truman, or I did. And there's a story that I love, which is Harry Truman, after he served his time in office, he went back to Independence, Missouri, and he and Bess just took a long road trip. They got in the car and they drove across the country. And they had no pension, they had no Secret Service protection, and he got a speeding ticket in Pennsylvania. And I just remember loving that story and telling it a few times because it just was, exactly the kind of citizen returning to his community, to the day-to-day of his life. Now, obviously, Harry Truman in the early 50s is very, very different from, the Bill Clintons of today, who are making, over $100 million in paid speeches since he left office. It's a very different model for the presidency. It's a very, very different model of service. But I think what that contrast is, and again, presidents are in a special club. Not even this club. It's a stratosphere that I could not begin to understand. But presidents tend not to stay in Washington because they don't have to. They can do their thing wherever. But Harry Truman's one of his idols was George Washington and also Cincinnatus. And these are two people who envisioned service national service as something that after you've done the loftiest of jobs, whether it's president, whether you're a general, whether you're the founder of your country, you return to your farm in the case of George Washington. You return to Independence, Missouri in the case of Harry Truman. And you re-immerse yourself in service. You help your neighbors. And people just stay in D.C. anymore now, and they don't go home, tend to. I mean, they will often say, I'm splitting time between Washington, D.C. and South Dakota, which usually means they'll spend maybe 90% of their time in Washington, D.C. and 10% of their time in South Dakota, and maybe their summer place in Florida. And they tend to build big houses, usually in Virginia. And that sort of becomes their life. They have punched a ticket into the permanent feudal class of Washington and politics. The narrative of this book really begins at the beginning of the Obama age. And here we are in year 5, year 6 of the Obama age. His election was historic for many, many reasons. But one of the things I will never forget about it was the incredible sense of hope and the incredible idealism that I saw in his campaign people. And the best part about my job is talking to young people, especially on campaigns, because you go out to Iowa, you go to New Hampshire, you go to South Carolina, and you see idealism really in its purest form. And I mean, yes, you see a lot of the same flavors of opportunism, of dog-eat-dog, of networking that you see throughout the characters of Washington in this town. But there is, but the Obama campaign was really quite special, and it revolutionized how money is raised on the internet. It revolutionized really how the modern version of grassroots organizing can get done. And they won. And there's a scene in my book that takes place in 2011, which was right after the first debt ceiling crisis. This was, the first of what has been a series of brinksmanship moments that have been upon the country the last few years. And President Obama was very frustrated. He didn't think that his staff was coordinating well with his then fledgling presidential campaign in Chicago. So what he did was he initiated a meeting every Saturday in which he brought in maybe about 10 to 15 aides from Chicago, from his outside consulting world, from the White House, and they would gather in the Roosevelt Room, and they would talk about how they could better coordinate their message, their strategy, what they really wanted to do. And in the first meeting, the president said, guys, I'm sort of nostalgic for 2008. We had this incredible openness. We had this incredible trust between us. And I think what happens is that splinters after a while. And when you get to Washington and the prize is no longer how do we get to the White House, you start looking, you start to cover your own backside, and you sort of lose a lot of the specialness of what we had in 2008. Well, I want to try to reclaim that. So they had a series of meetings every Saturday in the Roosevelt Room. And the president was talking very, very fondly about how good the meetings were and how high quality they were and how people were really exchanging ideas. He felt like tensions were being released. He felt that ideas were being marinated in ways that they hadn't in the first few years in the White House. And in the fourth or fifth meeting, the president was feeling comfortable enough that he decided that he would write on a yellow legal sheet of paper things that he wished he had been more vocal on in his first few years in office. And he had a few topics. He had climate change, he had Guantanamo Bay, the closing of Guantanamo Bay. He had gay marriage, he mentioned immigration. He mentioned things that he wished he were more vocal on. And sure enough, a couple days later, Jim Messina, the aforementioned Jim Messina, was sitting in headquarters in Chicago, and he was visited by a reporter who said, hey, I have this list here, and supposedly the president wished he were more vocal on A, B, C, and D. And so, obviously, the meeting had a leaker, and President Obama, every president hates leakers and leaks, but President Obama especially hates leaks. And everyone knew that the president was going to be really ticked off, and they were dreading what he was going to do at the next meeting. And at the next Saturday meeting, sure enough, he showed up. He addressed it immediately. He said, guys, what happened here? I trusted you. You really let me down. These meetings have been great, and I hope they continue in some way, but if they do, it'll be without me. And he gets up and he leaves. And Vice President Biden stays behind, and he sort of chews out everyone. He says, guys, you let the man down. How could you do this? Who would do this? Biden leaves. And then there's this reckoning left behind, and people start yelling at each other, and there was sort of this soul-searching meeting with all of the Obama idealists of 2008 sort of wondering what had happened to them. And finally, Robert Gibbs, the longtime press secretary for President Obama, said, guys, did we change Washington, or did Washington change us? And that's the big question that sort of runs through the narrative of this book, but it also gives a sense of the power of Washington to sort of morph a sort of common interest, whether it's the ideal of getting President or then Senator Obama elected, to people looking out for their own. And if you think of why someone would leak something like that, again, I speak as a journalist who doesn't mind such things. I think these things are healthy. I love receiving leaks of that sort. So having said that, it also is an act of self-interest by whoever the leaker was. It is an indication that they want to get in good with a reporter. They want to show how important they are. They want to, maybe get something in return from a reporter to build his or her brand going forward. So when it comes time to get his own media gig after they leave, when it comes time to get a lobbying job or something, they will be seen as important by people who make these decisions. And again, I have seen over and over and over again, and you're starting to see it a little bit with some of the Tea Party people who came in 2010 with the intentions that they were going to drain the swamp. And many of them have obviously changed the face of the Republican Party and the MO of the Republican Party to a degree that a lot of what we're seeing now is caught up in that. But again, Trent Lott, God bless him, he's very, very honest, say that for him, said, yeah, it's great these Tea Party people are coming into town. This was about 2010, right after they were elected. He said, but we can't wait to just co-opt them. And again, it was this moment of incredible candor in which, people who have been in Washington a long time feel with utter self-assurance that they can get people to sort of come around to the ways of D.C. And now, the question is, now we have a situation where things have ground to a halt. And there is a sense right now that, something obviously, I think, my personal opinion, I have no inside information on this, is that this will get settled probably before the debt ceiling thing. I have, no inside information. I just think that the level of risk that people are taking now will probably tip over to a point where something will get done. But having said that, again, for a long time, and for many, many years, especially recently, Washington has profited a great deal on not getting things done. Whenever an immigration bill does not get done, that is good for the lobbyists, that is good for the consultants, that is good for the cable channels that have all these shouting matches between people on both sides of the non-existent immigration bill. We haven't had a big bill passed, certainly bipartisan bill, in a long, long time. And again, disagreement is what drives Washington. And the business of lobbying, the business of consulting, quite often the business of punditry, the business of political professionalism is predicated on fighting, it's predicated on friction, it's predicated on what is in many cases a dog and pony show of disagreement. And what you have here is professional Democrats and professional Republicans. If you look at what the former chairman of the Democratic and Republican National Committees do after they leave. I mean, Terry McAuliffe, who will be possibly, or very probably, I would say, the next governor of Virginia, and Ed Gillespie, his counterpart at the Republican National Committee during the last decade, they often go on the road together and they give these paid speeches, and corporations or whoever will pay them $50,000 just to argue on stage, because it's sort of become this big theatrical thing. And Ed and Terry are good friends, and they met in the green room backstage of the cable shows that they were fighting on, but really they were sort of hatching this friendship, and friendship is good, but essentially it's a business proposition where I'm a professional righty pundit and you're a professional lefty pundit. And Jack Quinn, who's a character in the book, who was the general counsel under Bill Clinton during the mid-90s, he left the White House and he joined with Ed Gillespie to start what was one of the first bipartisan lobbying shops in D.C. They started in about 2000. And these are two very well-known Democrats and Republicans, and they built a huge business, and they wound up selling out for about $40 million after maybe 3 or 4 years. And I was talking to Jack, who is still a lobbyist. He runs Quinn Gillespie now, and he's still there, even though they're owned by a British conglomerate. And I said, so what was it about Ed Gillespie that made you decide that you could go into business with him? What was it about Ed? I mean, why did you decide that you could be business partners? And Jack said to me, well, Ed got the joke. And I'm like, well, what's the joke? I don't get it. He goes, well, I mean, the joke. I'm like, Jack, I don't know what the joke is. Tell me what the joke is. Is it a secret handshake or what? And he said, well, the joke is that everyone's a patriot. I'm like, what? Like everyone's a patriot, meaning that we can sort of come together and just sort of join a bipartisan business, and you can do your thing and he can do his thing, and basically that the whole game here is to make money and to succeed and not work in any public interest, but work for whoever the highest the highest bidder is. And he said, yeah, something like that. And again, there are these moments in reporting this book that I've come across amazing instances of transparency like that. But I guess I later learned that getting the joke is a big lobbying term. And people who get the joke is essentially people who get the wink, people who get the secret handshake, which is we take care of each other. And there is a system in place in Washington that for as much as people are fighting, that the notion of being on the inside is a place in essentially in a club. I mean, one of the working titles for this book was The Club. But you are in, and you are in for life. And I would say that the biggest distinction I draw in this book is not between Democrats and Republicans, not between liberals and conservatives. It's between people who are in the club and people who are outside of the club. Which brings me to me and my role and why I, as a club member in good standing, decided to embark on something like this, which was an absolutely I would say difficult thing to do, and it's not easy for a person in the club to write critically about other people in the club. And I remember saying to myself, actually saying to a friend of mine, right after I started, right around the time when I was saying, what on earth have I gotten myself into? That was maybe the first of 10 or so times a week I would say that. But I remember saying, I think one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I feel maybe too much like an insider. And I think a journalist should never feel that much like an insider. A journalist shouldn't be as comfortable as someone with with access to everything, with easy relations to senators and White House officials. And I think that what I want to do is I want to write something that will be maybe semi-controversial, that will open people's eyes outside of town to what this all looks like. And if it makes me less comfortable and less welcome to some of these parties, I think that would be a good thing, because it would ensure that I get to become sort of less a part of the club, which I think will help me both professionally and also personally, because I find this world decadent, and I find it boring, and I find it repetitive, and I find it, again, very, very self-serving and self-dealing. And I had found, I guess, for years, a replication of the Tim Russert funeral scene in any number of settings, whether it's a book party, whether it's a State of the Union address, whether it's the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is this horrific, cancerous dinner which is held every spring and has metastasized into this horrible, horrible charade of like 25 parties and after parties and people from Hollywood coming, and the New York Times bans its reporters from going. So I'm full of virtue here because I don't go anymore. But they basically said that we don't want to participate in something that makes reporters, the story. We don't want to be part of something that's so cozy, such a spectacle that is frankly unseemly. And I don't want to put us on a righteous plane here, but I think it's a really good decision. But I wanted to take that a step further and really undress this. And it was really, really hard. And I wrote the book and I saw a lot of things and it was hard to write. And then all of a sudden, there was this anticipation about the book. And there was a lot of buzz about the book, which I guess is good when you're selling books, but it's a weird thing to be in the middle of. Because as a reporter, I'm used to being the wise guy in the back taking notes, not the guy at the podium giving a speech. Two of the most dangerous or scary words for any reporter is featured speaker. And here I am doing just that. And that's a weird position for me to be in. But and a lot of people were coming to me before the book came out and say, well, what are you writing about me? And I would say, what are you writing about my client? And he said, am I in there? And I would say, well, if you were in there, you would know it because I'd have fact-checked it. He said, well, why aren't I in there? I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, do you want to be in there? He goes, yeah, could you at least mention me in connection? And I would be fact-checking these things, and people would be asking, they would be going into elaborate detail about what they wanted me to say about them and what embarrassing stories they wanted told because, again, it became a data point for my point, which is that everyone wants to be seen as an insider. Everyone wants to be seen as part of this club. And as this book, I guess, was seen as a takedown, as a tell-all about the club, people saw it as being perhaps a badge of honor to be mentioned in here. So one of the first things I did with the book, and you will see, I hope you'll all read it because, my kids have to go to college after they've graduated from elementary school with their fine record of public service on the student council, is there's no index. And there's this thing in Washington called the Washington Read, which is that everyone who thinks they're important, which is about 90% of the population, will go into a bookstore, look at a book, and they will immediately go to the index to see if they are mentioned in there. And if they are, they will go and they'll see, and if it's a quick passing reference, or if they're not mentioned at all, God forbid, they will slam the book closed and they will shove it back on the shelf unpurchased. So Richard Ben Kramer, who was one of my idols, he wrote the book What It Takes, who just died in January, which is this seminal book on the 1988 presidential campaign and it really, really deep profiles of 6 people who ran for president. He invented the no index thing, and he said, I just want people to read the damn book. And he said that, I read an interview with him right before he died, and so he inspired me to do that. And sure enough, there was enough buzz around the book that 2 days after it came out, the Washington Post published its own index of this town, and they mentioned like all 920 however many people online, and they listed everyone in alphabetical order and what page they were on. And then I was doing this is a This Town moment, I was in my first green room doing my first TV interview about the book on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and Amy Klobuchar, a senator from Minnesota, walks in, points to me and says, I'm in your book. I'm like, are you? I guess, yeah, I mentioned you once. She goes, yes, I'm on page 242, but I haven't read it yet. What did you say about me? I'm like, how do you know you're on page 242? It's like, everyone knows what page they're on. They read the index. I said, so anyway, but so there was all this, all of a sudden, there was this big wave of interest, and the book came out 2 weeks before it was supposed to because some idiot salesperson, gave early copies to the Hudson News in Newark Airport, and a reporter from BuzzFeed found this and was going home for 4th of July weekend and like wrote little tidbits the entire time and said, hey, this is what he says on page 522. No, there wasn't 5. There's not that long. It's not that long a book. It ends at page 360 or something. But anyway, he was writing about little tidbits. But so then there was this build-up, and then the initial reviews were really good, and then there was this wave of criticism about me. And I was stunned by the tenor of the criticism, which was never, you got this wrong, you completely misidentified, mischaracterized our way of life here. You were too negative on Washington. No one rose to the defense of this decadent culture I wrote about. The critique against me, in large part, was, how dare he? How dare someone on the inside speak right critically about others on the inside? And the subtext there was, but aren't we supposed to like sort of keep up the racket? Aren't we supposed to like, you know, it's good for us here. Why do you want to name names? Why do you want to hurt people's feelings? And I was stunned by that. And Politico, which is this online political newspaper, which is trying to be the, well, for politics, what ESPN is for sports, and has succeeded in a great degree. Politico wrote a story, basically said, you know, Mark violated the unwritten rules of Washington, which is, you know, people on the inside are supposed to take care of each other. And it reminds me of a quote from my former colleague Henry Allen at the Washington Post, who is, you know, one of the great writers ever. And he had this line about Washington, which is that Washington sort of feels uncomfortably like a conspiracy sometimes, that everyone sort of knows, except for people on the outside, that they don't fully understand it, except that they pay for it. And it's true. And I actually, I think conspiracy is the wrong word, because it makes it sound like there's a bunch of people whispering, planning what to do every day, and it's not that organized. It certainly isn't in a newsroom. But what that told me was that it was time to try to, in a more exhaustive way, write about what was going on inside this club. And so the next phase of this after it came out was I started going on the road. I started leaving Washington. And the response was so much more thoughtful and so much more authentic and so much smarter. And people were, I mean, the people were not concerned about who came off well, who came off badly, what were the little tidbits of news in there. And they wanted to know, you know, how did we get here? How did this happen? And the level of civic concern and frankly, horror that this book has awakened, in an entertaining way, of course, from people outside of town has been extremely refreshing. And I have loved leaving town and coming to places, I mean, all over the country, but I've had some of the most thoughtful discussions I've ever had about Washington, often as far away from the places you can possibly get in the United States, like Missoula, Montana. People ask me a lot, what is the line that gets the most attention? What is the one thing that people always come back to you and quote? And I thought about this, and the line occurs in chapter 10. And this is for the sake of answering a question that I probably will get later, or might, or even if I didn't, this is a question I often get. And 2011, there is, again, nothing more important in Washington than the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Everyone must be there. Everyone must dress appropriately. Everyone must get a great date from Hollywood. The president authenticates the occasion every single year by showing up and giving a speech. And that happened to be the weekend in 2011 in early May, or late April, early May, that the raid on Osama bin Laden in Pakistan was scheduled for. And a few days before the raid, the very small handful of officials who knew about the raid were meeting in the Situation Room talking about the timing of this. And originally the raid was scheduled for a Saturday night. It turns out it was a Sunday night, as you'll recall. And when someone raised Saturday night, maybe the chief of staff, I guess it would have been Bill Daley at the time, said, well, the president's scheduled to speak at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Many of us are scheduled to be there. And if we don't show up, or if there's all this fuss going on, people will assume, especially the journalists in the room, that maybe something's up, and maybe our hand will be tipped. And Hillary Clinton, who was in the back, hadn't said anything, looks up, and I promised the provost, Mr. Brown, that I would not use the actual language, so I will say, Hillary Clinton then looked up and said, F the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And everyone sort of like looked up and said, did she really just say that? And I'm not going to tell you what the F stands for, but I spell it out in the book, so you'll have to read the book. And you can't find it in the index because there's no index. But a number of people in writing about this said that Hillary Clinton, because of that anecdote alone, comes off best in the book because she disses the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which I'm guessing if she's elected president, she will appear at every single year and give a very serviceable stand-up comedic speech. So speaking of speeches, again, I much prefer conversational things to speeches. I would love to know what you all are concerned about, if you have questions about the book. I guess I would say in closing that the other question I get a lot, and more so outside of town, again, than I get in Washington, is you read a book like this, and it's a cynical read, and there's no question it's a cynical read. Do you ever wonder, Mark, how, whether you're too cynical, whether you maybe should go on to something else or leave town or something like that? And my answer usually comes in a couple parts. One, I live in Washington, and this is going to sound utterly contradicting of everything I've said to this point, but it's actually a really nice place to raise a family. And now, there's history all around, and my kids love their schools, and my wife loves her job, and I love my job, and we love our neighbors, and life is what happens to you even when you're, plunked down in the most disappointing city in the country. It's also a very exhilarating place to live. But I think the larger point there is that this book might be cynical, and I think that any reporter, especially working in Washington as long as I have, who doesn't become cynical is doing something far more heroic than I've done, because you cannot live or work in Washington without having a very, very strong radar to people talking to you in a certain way, in the language of obsequiousness, in the language of spin, in the language of flat-out lies, in the language of using someone and opportunism. But my book comes from a place of idealism, and it's the idealism of someone who drops his kids off at school every day. The vice president's motorcade comes by every morning to where the school is. And it was true when Cheney was vice president, it's true when Biden's vice president. And you just see these kids every single morning just staring at the motorcade, knowing that something momentous is going on inside. And, we live a couple miles away from where history is being made. And that's exciting. And what it also does is it actually, I found, renews my belief that our government has to be doing better, and we have to be worthy of the history around us and worthy of the momentous sights that we see every day and the people that we get to be around. And I want my kids to appreciate that as youngsters, as people who live in Washington. And I want them to be proud of their hometown, just as I was my hometown. And, people in Missoula are rightly proud of their hometown. So I would say, and maybe this is not spelled out in the book, but I will say, from a personal standpoint, people, I do want to try to say to people that this comes from a place of idealism, and I don't think, I just hope, especially when you're in an environment with young people like this one is, that people will just keep going. I'm a big proponent of people getting involved in their communities. Young reporters come to me all the time and say, how do I break in? It looks like a really fun Disneyland-like world in Washington. You get to be on TV, and you get to be famous. You get to go to these websites and like develop a blog. And I'm a big proponent of immersing oneself in your community, working for a small paper if you're a journalist, getting involved in a local campaign, getting involved in local issues. Because, look, it is still, despite what you're seeing on the evening news about Washington, it is still an amazing country, an amazing system, and there's a lot of reasons to be patriotic, despite the day-to-day despair and, frankly, the day-to-day appallingness that I laid out in the book. And if that sounds hollow in light of what I have written and what I have said, so be it. But I actually think that these two impulses do coexist in me, and I think the day the second part of that dies, might be time to actually think about moving somewhere else, starting a new career and so forth. So I do want to think that this comes from a place of wanting to do better, wanting the country to do better, wanting a truth to be told that hadn't been told before, and frankly, going to a place for myself, but also for my club, that is far less comfortable than what has grown up there. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for having me. I want to encourage as many questions as you have, and I love answering questions. And I guess Dennis is going to come up and moderate whatever questions. But thank you all very much. This has been great.
I just want to tell you that we have some microphones set up along the center aisle at both ends. So if you want to line up to ask questions, we'll give it a whirl. So if anyone's ready, we'll begin. There.
Hey, Mr. Leibovich, first of all, thanks for coming. I was wondering, as journalists, we have a responsibility to hold politicians accountable. But how do you balance being objective and fair to both sides when you strongly believe that one side's basic premises are clearly bullshit, if you'll excuse my language? And then second of all, how do you kind of appease some of these political sources, some of these people on the inside, while also making sure that you don't become a puppet for their various agendas?
Great questions. I mean, first of all, the second question is, I try not to appease anyone. I mean, I think, you know, the second you are acting like a puppet, you're not a journalist anymore. But I think the first question, I mean, the notion, we talked about this earlier in the seminar, the notion of objectivity is one that gets thrown out a lot because people on both sides of the spectrum think that the other side is weighted against them in the media. And as I said earlier, I mean, I think objectivity is, I mean, there's really no such thing as objectivity in journalism. I mean, a journalist makes a million choices every single, well, not every, I mean, not a million, but a lot of choices around every story. Who to quote, what words to omit, what words to use, who to call. Then your editor will make a whole other layer of choices. And I have been lucky in that I've worked for places like the Washington Post style section, now the Times Magazine, where basically my biases have been able to have sort of been apparent, but it's not a left-right bias, it's not so much a political bias, because I'm actually not a terribly ideological person at all. It's a bias towards authenticity. If someone I believe is being straight with me, someone is honest, someone is admirable, I think it tends to come through in my writing more. And if someone is trying to spin me or is behaving in a way that I think is inauthentic, I tend to bring that to life. Like if a public relations person is going to interrupt an interview to sort of go over a talking point with his or her boss, I'm going to point that out because I think readers need to know this. I mean, I'm a big believer in transparency and a big believer in holding a mirror to the culture of BS that frankly we operate in. And that's sort of a writ large mission for the entire book. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. You've expressed a lot of criticisms on mainly disconnect in Washington as well as interconnection and a lot of problems. Do you think your book is going to make a difference in correcting those problems, and do you even want to correct those problems?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, the book has already corrected every single problem, as you can see. You know, everything is perfect now, and it's been out for 3 months. No, I mean, all I can say is that the feedback has been pretty amazing. I mean, there have been a lot of people who claim to be genuinely humbled by the picture I painted of, you know, the professional Washington set. You know, former senators, people who I don't think I'm terribly flattering of in the book. I do, look, I'm realistic. I mean, this is just a book and I'm just one reporter. And I mean, maybe I took some chances and maybe it's seen as more maybe controversial or something more edgy. But I think ultimately information awareness is a really powerful tool. And I mean, every little bit of awareness that you can produce helps. And I mean, a president of the United States can come in and claim to change everything and have very, very limited success, as President Obama himself has admitted. But look, I think it's an important story. I mean, I think helping people understand the absurdity of this world rather than the broad sort of contours of, yeah, it's just a swamp, it's broken. Helping people understand the hypocrisy, helping people know who these people are, who they're working for, is a valuable form that adds to the cache of transparency that reporters are trying to add to, hopefully, you know, on most days. So, you know. Yeah. Oh, actually, should we? Do you want to go to the microphone or? Oh, okay. I'm gonna like. Dan, why don't you go to a microphone? We'll have. Okay. Okay. Well, all right. I'll go, and then I'll take you. So.
Okay. You said earlier, sorry, that you wanted to sort of not necessarily get out, but to sort of distance yourself from being an insider. You wanted to make yourself less comfortable being in Washington. So my question is, have you succeeded? Are you blacklisted anywhere? Do they see you in the crowd and walk a little faster?
Well, here I am in Montana, right? Yeah. If there's actually a blacklist anywhere, I don't know if I'm on it. I'm sure. The short, sort of glib answer is I honestly don't care if I'm not invited to a bunch of these stupid parties anymore. They're really boring. One of the things you learn in Washington is you probably have to be more careful choosing your friends than you do in most places. And my rule in doing this book is I wasn't going to lose any real friends. And I didn't. I lost some fake friends, I know. And, friendship in Washington is a notion that can be as cheap as it is like on Facebook. It's just you collect friends. It's like, hey, I have this friend and that friend. You ever heard like the Clintons talk about, well, I'm a friend of Bill, and he's a longtime friend. And the default way you mention friends in the Senate is my good friend from Louisiana and my good friend from Massachusetts. And these are people who usually hate each other. So that's how artificial it is. But no, I think rather than my name appearing on a blacklist and me being cast out of some secret society, I think it was my own internal process of being independent and being my own, and sort of reclaiming my own soul to some degree. And Tom Brokaw, who is, I actually think, one of the heroes of this book for reasons you might see. He's a huge opponent of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Spends a good amount of time in Montana. He is someone who went on this big screed against the Correspondents' Dinner last year, and he said, if you go, it will steal your soul. And I think, this sounds a little more cosmic than I usually get, but you do have to take care of your soul in D.C., especially after you've been there a while. And look, it's fine to make money, it's fine to strive for power, it's fine to want to be on TV. I live in a city full of these people. But one of the reasons I tell young people that they should maybe delay going to D.C. is it gives you a chance to know who you are, and it gives you a chance to sort of view your soul honestly. And I think that's an important skill, and it's one that you get from experience, and it's one you get by challenging yourself. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to, maybe this is a cry for help or something, I don't know, but that's one of the reasons I guess I decided to take this project on. So.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah. You sure? Okay.
I have what's maybe a curious question for you, Mark. The picture you paint of the club is that the members are shameless in terms of anything we would understand. What does shame them?
What does shame them? It's a terrific question. It's funny, Tom Coburn, the senator from Oklahoma, is writing a book on the psychology of power. And Coburn is a very interesting, very smart guy. He's arguably the father of the Tea Party movement. He's written some really thoughtful books on the notion of what he calls the permanent feudal class of Washington, D.C. And he has a whole thing about shame, which is that essentially, many people's capacity for shame in Washington in particular is overrun by their need for fame. Rhymes with shame. Fame, power, all these sort of accoutrements of being in a powerful place. And look, people are exposed all the time, people are embarrassed all the time, but what we've seen over and over and over again is there's always a next act. I devote a whole chapter in here to a completely self-made Washington opportunist who didn't even go to college, just came here from California, glommed onto a congressman, became really famous for Washington, started going on TV, and who had this dramatic fall after sharing emails with a reporter who was writing a book about Washington, me, and he lost his job. and I wrote a whole chapter about his rise and fall and his reckoning. And within 2 months of him losing his job, he was hired at his old job. No one really said anything. And now he was sending me emails the other day saying, hey, I'm making my Fox News debut next week. And I have new clients. I've started my own political strategy company. So, look, there's always a next act. I mean, Anthony Weiner will probably make millions of dollars on the speaking circuit. He might run for something again. You know, it's a pretty easy town in some ways. And you know, legitimate shame, I think, would be people leaving town and not coming back. But no one ever really leaves. And so I can't look into the psyches of what brings shame, how the civic psyche of Washington is different from that in other places. But yeah, shameless is a word you hear a lot, and it's frankly an apt description in many cases. So.
Hello. Do you think there's a way to reverse or lessen the division of the political parties?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, look, the problem is the reward system now is such that the extremes are rewarded. And, I mean, the Republicans in the House now who are absolutely refusing to deal, or back down from, dealing with, from revoking Obamacare, are not afraid of not being reelected because their districts are such that they are very safe, and their big concern is not having a Republican primary opponent rather than a Democrat. I mean, look, this is the part of the conversation where if I were king, or if Senator X or President Y were king, you could say, the gerrymandered districts, the ideologically driven media has pulled this apart to a degree that I think is, frankly, much greater than it really is. I mean, you go to a place like this and you always say, all right, how many Democrats in the audience, how many Republicans in the audience, how many people have neighbors, friends, relatives who are in the other party? Everyone raises their hand. Then you say, do you genuinely care about these people? Everyone raises their hand. Do you talk over dinner? Everyone raises their hand. This brings me to another story from one of my daughters, my middle daughter, who I remember I was watching the announcement of Paul Ryan being Mitt Romney's running mate 2 summers ago. And she was 8 years old at the time, and she was watching Paul Ryan's speech, and she said, hey, he seems kind of nice. And she liked him, she thought he was really cool, and she liked that he has a daughter named Liza. Her name is Eliza. My daughter's name is Eliza. And she said, yeah, he's really, really nice. And then it came to the part in his speech where he started trashing President Obama and Vice President Biden. And my daughter said, that's not very nice. And she said, yeah, it's true. She said, does he know President Obama? I said, yeah, they probably met a few times, but I don't think they know each other well. She said, does Mitt Romney know President Obama? I said, I don't think they've met. Maybe they've met a couple times. And she said, well, if they knew each other, they might not talk this way about each other. And it was another one of those out of the mouth. I should give my daughters a commission. They've like my speechwriting commission. But again, it was a moment where I think what most people would know intuitively, even whether you're an 8-year-old or whether you're someone sitting out in a blue state or a red state, when you actually talk to people and get to know them, I mean, you foster a culture of consensus. Now, we actually now live in a system where 6 hours a day is being spent by some of these senators and congressmen, going into a boiler room trying to raise money because that's what they got to do to stay in office. They're not going to be noticed unless they say something outrageous to get on Fox or MSNBC or, something to get them noticed. That's not fostering consensus. So again, the system now is set up for non-collaboration. And I mean, I do think, and whether this is a source of hope or not, I mean, I do think that the basic decency is a very powerful force, and I hope ultimately it'll prevail because I think there's a tremendous appetite for it. I mean, I think, look, I mean, President Obama and Speaker Boehner, I think, if they were to forge a deal tomorrow, and I think they could, if it was just the two of them and they didn't have their constituencies to worry about, certainly in Boehner's case, if we didn't have the Republicans in the House to worry about, they could do a deal tomorrow, and it would be a broad deal And I think it would probably incorporate entitlements, it would incorporate the deficit, it would incorporate taxation. I mean, it could do a lot of stuff if it was just the two of them. And because these are two basic, I think, consensus-driven people. These are people who, I think that's where their heart is. But the fact is, they can't do that because, I mean, Speaker Boehner has a constituency he's got to worry about, and the constituency could make him a former speaker just like that. And if he's seen as dealing with President Obama, that's probably going to be the end of his speakership. Same with a Republican candidate for president. Hillary Clinton, arguably, one of the reasons she lost the Democratic nomination in 2008 was because she was seen as too conciliatory to the Bush administration. I mean, she was for the Iraq War. And again, consensus is not rewarded in the two parties and in the system we're in. So, look, I mean, there are polls of division are very, very strong these days, both in the media and in the political constituencies in Congress. I would like to think that people could cooperate in Washington like they do, I think, in most communities. So. Yep.
A question about how would the political landscape change if someone were to drop the bottom out of the lobbyist industry?
If someone were to drop a bottom?
Just basically make them as financially bankrupt as they are morally bankrupt.
I would probably predict that that's not going to happen anytime soon, but if it did. Look, I mean, it's a huge source of fundraising, so people would have to get their money elsewhere. Look, I mean, lobbyists write a lot of bills. I mean, part of it is because they're experts in this. Part of them came right from the Hill to work in these lobbying firms. But no, they have an incredible amount of power. And, corporations are paying, millions of dollars for them to do this. So I think it would be extremely healthy. I think laws would be, a lot more complex. I think they would be more easily written. I think there would be more power to individuals rather than the powerful interests that tend to afford lobbyists. It would be a very different system. But this is what we have now. So, what's interesting is in reporting this book, I read a ton of books that no one else read. And Jack Abramoff, who was the picture of Washington disgrace, this lobbyist who went to jail for 30 months for all kinds of corruption. He wrote this book in prison in which he talks about how when he was a lobbyist, he would always have these relationships with Republicans in Congress, a lot of Republican staffers in Congress. And after a while, after they became friends, he would say to them, after a while, after you're done, serving on the Hill, you got to come think about working for us. And they would be non-committal. They would say, all right, maybe I will. And Abramoff, essentially saying, you can make a 7-figure salary the day you leave this job. And if you maintain this relationship we have now, if you do a good job for me now, that offer is still going to stand. And Abramoff writes in his book that the second I could have that conversation with people, I owned them. So, it makes you wonder, who are these people working for now? Are they working for their next gig? Are they working for the people who elected their boss or elected them? Who are these 50% of senators who go on to become lobbyists working for? Are they working for their constituents? Are they working for, the $3 million salary they could get if they vote a certain way? So, again, that's part of the revolving door that I think is extremely corrupting to the system. And I laid that out pretty exhaustively in the book, but I think that the degree to which the revolving door runs in both directions, I don't think people fully appreciate. So, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for coming to Missoula. I've enjoyed listening to you speak. I'm wondering if your daughter had become President of the United States yesterday in lieu of her current prestigious position, what words of advice would you give to her to better the lives and meet the needs of American citizens?
If she were elected President of the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Geez, I don't know. Don't listen to your dad. Be really nice to the press. Give them everything they want. Geez, I don't know. This is going to sound really simplistic, but know yourself. The one thing I'm actually usually impressed by with presidents of both parties is they put up with a lot of crap. You know, there is, in people, you know, President Bush, President Obama, President Clinton, President Reagan, President Bush, I mean, I'm always amazed at the grace that people in that office are able to show, because I would probably end my career in maybe 10 minutes if I were ever made president. But I don't know. I mean, know yourself. I mean, know who you are. Know who you're working for. Know that, I mean, know your limitations. I mean, I think the presidency is such an insanely big and overwhelming and almost inhuman job at this point. I'd probably encourage her to do something else. But I think, look, if she could be president, it'd be pretty cool. So, and I'd be really proud. And I could probably get a, you know, decent meal at the White House every once in a while. And they might even have a room for me, like Michelle Obama's mother. There's a room at the White House. But I don't know. Be nice, be kind, be strong. How's that for a place to start? So, yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll take both of your questions. Why don't you go first and then you can go.
First off, thank you very much for having the integrity to write your book. That's a lot more than a lot of other reporters do have. And my question kind of goes off that, because something that we've seen especially recently is, I'm sure that a lot of doors were closed on you when you did write that book, when you acted as a whistleblower. And
say it again, I missed that.
I'm sure that a lot of doors were closed when you acted as a whistleblower and basically called out all this corruption in Washington. How do you have an end in sight when, as a media, a news writer, you basically lose your career, you lose your access to Washington when you actually tell the truth as it is?
God, that's pretty harsh. Wow, is it that bad? No, I don't think it's that bad. I mean, look, I think I clearly ruffled some feathers. I clearly ticked some people off. There's no question about it. But look, I mean, that's part of the deal. I mean, I think your job in this, your job as a journalist is not always to be liked, and I just don't see any, you know, serious doors closed on me that are going to make it hard for me to do my job. I mean, it hasn't been true over the last 3 months. Of course, I've spent most of the summer out of town, but yeah, I mean, and I guess I just don't care. I don't think. I mean, I think the more popular you are in, you know, in the club, you know, if you're a journalist, it's probably not a great place to be. So I don't anticipate it'll be a problem. If it is, maybe I'll reevaluate and I'll think about doing something else. But I don't see it as a problem. In fact, I see it on the contrary. I mean, people have been more willing to talk to me. I think a lot of people have thanked me, which has been great, and they've said, you know, this needed to be said. It wasn't always easy to read, but it was really, I think, important, and I hope you'll write a sequel. So that's been cool. But look, I'm not that worried. So.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Yep.
Welcome to Missoula. You aptly described an incredibly dysfunctional family. And I recall that it was President Eisenhower who explained to us to beware of the military-industrial complex. What you described to me is so dysfunctional, and I'm thankful that we still have the rule of law, but if this kind of dysfunction goes on, what do you perceive will happen to our country as a result of this vacuum? Because you know nature abhors a vacuum. And so do you have any perceptions that you might be able to give us?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is sustainable. I mean, look, Washington's been dysfunctional for a long time, and Washington's been unpopular for a long time. And, you know, back in the 18th century, there were candidates who were running against Washington and running against the elitists on the inside. So that's not new. And I think the distinction I make between the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower wrote about is, you know, I call it now a media-industrial complex. I sort of make the club about all of the people who just want to be on TV and be sort of in the room and in the inner ring, which is a C.S. Lewis term that Senator Coburn writes about in his book. I don't think this is sustainable. I mean, people have predicted that this is basically Rome all over again and the fall is coming. I'm not, I don't know if, I'm not going to say that, but I will say that I just don't think it's sustainable when you have this level of revulsion on the outside and this level of, frankly, like, arrogance and self-satisfaction on the inside. I just think eventually people will maybe elect a third-party candidate, or people will demand public officials who shake things up so much that their republic will be, or the government in Washington will be completely unrecognizable. But I don't know. I mean, the real challenge of this book has been to convince people not to despair to a point of total paralysis and disengagement. Because I do think that faith itself, whether in the system or whether in one's life, or belief that things can be better, is a very powerful thing if you're willing to work for it. And you can do it at a community level. And someone was asking me earlier what the sources of hope were in the book. And I think, I would say a couple things. I mean, one is a lot of the young people I meet everywhere, especially on campaigns. Another is mayors and city council people and people who, in a very, very tangible way, are doing good. I mean, it could be volunteers, it could be any number of people. And that sounds a little bit small town, but it's actually important. And I think journalism, this extends to journalism also. I mean, I think community, your community is where you live. And I think you can't get so overtaken by the community of noise that governs Washington, D.C. now, and governs the media diet that so many people are on when it comes to how they take their politics. Politics can be an extremely satisfying and intimate thing, and it's easier to do so locally. But look, I mean, I've been at rallies, at political rallies on both sides, Republicans, Democrats, presidential rallies, whatever, and it's incredibly inspiring. I mean, you see what these moments do to people, and it's the power of belief. And I think that the power of belief is not, necessarily, it's not in the service of demagoguery always. I mean, belief is powerful, and the reason, people are engaged in this is because they care. And I think that, I hope that continues, because, yes, there's a level of disengagement and a level of incredible frustration in people with how the government is working or not working, but people keep going, and the republic keeps going, and hopefully it'll stay as resilient as it's been. But these are tough times, and I think hopefully I have added to the cache of shame that Washington seems very well equipped to create for itself every single day. So again, that's part of my grand marketing plan. I mean, every day the newspaper helps sell books, so this is good. You can help. Now, actually, I would actually give up sales of the books if it means we can get the government working again. But I just want to say, before I hang up, this has been tremendously great. I love, the questions have been great, the audience is great, and I hope I can come back here. I will make it, I will tell everyone to come to Montana, but I won't tell too many people so that it becomes crowded. But thank you for having me, and